Hey guys, tonight we begin with a job that sounds simple, until you actually live it. A medieval butcher. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You are born into this. Not by choice, by family. Your father is a butcher. His father was a butcher. And unless you suddenly develop a deep spiritual calling or run away dramatically, which, let's be honest, is unlikely, this is also going to be your future. From your earliest memories, something feels slightly off. Other children grow up around fields, wood smoke, maybe a bit of mud. You grow up around inventory, very organic inventory. Your home is not separate from your father's work. It is the work. There is always movement, animals arriving, voices calling, tools being handled, water being thrown across floors that never quite reach what we would call clean. And then there's the smell. At first you don't question it. It's just air, thick, heavy, persistent. A combination of blood, fat, damp straw, wood, and whatever yesterday left behind that didn't fully agree to leave. You assume this is how everywhere smells. Because why wouldn't you? You are 5. You have no reference point. Then one day you go outside, and something strange happens. Other children do not smell like you. They smell like dirt, grass, possibly poor life decisions, but not this. They notice, not directly. No one walks up and says, "You smell like your house is having a problem." But they pause. They stand slightly farther away. They look at you like you've brought the environment with you. Which, to be fair, you have. This is the moment you realize something important. You are different. Not because of who you are, because of what you smell like. As you grow older, curiosity replaces confusion. You start watching your father work. At first from a distance, then from the doorway, then from slightly closer than you probably should be. Animals arrive alive. They do not leave that way, and no one gives you a gentle explanation. There is no careful conversation, no comforting metaphor. It's just happening, right there. Every day, at first you look away, then you look back. Then eventually you stop reacting. Because children adapt quickly, even to things that would make most adults reconsider their life choices. By the time you're old enough to help, something has changed. The smell doesn't bother you anymore, which is convenient and slightly alarming. You no longer notice the sounds. You no longer hesitate. The environment that once felt overwhelming now feels normal, which is exactly the problem. Because this is your world. You didn't choose it. You didn't grow into it gradually. You were simply placed into it and adjusted, quietly, slowly, until one day you realize that what feels normal to you would send most people running in the opposite direction, and that's your first lesson as a butcher. You don't just learn the job. You become the only kind of person who can tolerate it. By the time you're old enough to help, you probably expect something meaningful. Maybe your father will finally hand you a knife. Maybe this is the moment you become important. It is not. You clean. That's your first promotion. From child who watches to child who deals with consequences. You carry buckets. Heavy ones. Buckets filled with things that were recently part of something else and are now separate. You don't ask questions, mostly because you already know the answers. You scrub floors that do not reward effort. No matter how much you clean, they never look clean. At best, they look less alarming, which, in this line of work, counts as success. Your father doesn't give long explanations. He doesn't sit you down and say, "Here is the philosophy of butchery." He shows you, briefly, directly. This is how you hold the bucket. This is how you don't spill it. This is how you avoid stepping in something that will ruin your entire day. You learn quickly, not because you're naturally gifted, because mistakes are memorable and sometimes painful. Tools are everywhere. Knives, hooks, cleavers. They are not decorative. They are very real, very sharp, and very uninterested in your inexperience. You are constantly aware of them. Even when you're just cleaning, especially when you're just cleaning. Because this is the part no one tells you. The dangerous part of the job isn't when you're focused. It's when you're not. So you stay focused. You move carefully. You listen more than you speak. You try not to get in the way, which is harder than it sounds in a place where everything is moving, dripping, or being carried somewhere urgently. And then there's the smell. It's stronger now, because you're closer to it. You're not just nearby anymore. You're involved. You carry it, literally, on your hands, on your clothes, possibly in ways you'd rather not think about. At some point you realize something else. No one thanks you. Not your father. Not the customers. Not even yourself. Because this isn't a job you do for recognition. It's a job you do because it needs to be done. And because eventually, you will be the one teaching someone else how to clean the same floor, in exactly the same way, without explaining why. Because by then, you won't think it needs explaining anymore. At some point, the transition happens. Not announced, not celebrated, no speech, no milestone moment. No, today you become a man. Just a quiet shift in expectations. You are no longer just cleaning. You are now involved. Your father doesn't dramatically hand you a blade like it's some sacred object. He just places it in your hand and watches, which is somehow more intimidating. The animal is in front of you, alive, aware, and for the first time this is not something happening near you. It is something you are expected to do, and this is the part no one prepares you for. Because up until now, everything has been routine. Dirty, unpleasant, exhausting, but routine. This is different. You hesitate. Of course you do. That's normal. If you didn't hesitate, that would be more concerning. Your father notices. He doesn't comfort you. He doesn't say, take your time. He says just enough to make it clear, this is your job. And jobs do not wait for feelings. So you act. Not confidently. Not gracefully. But you act. And once it's done, something changes. Not dramatically. There's no moment of reflection where you suddenly understand everything. It's quieter than that. You just move on. Because there is more to do. There is always more to do. And that's the strange part. The first time feels significant. But the job doesn't treat it that way. It doesn't slow down. It doesn't pause to let you process what just happened. It continues. Immediately. Which means you don't have time to think. Only time to work. And over time, that becomes the pattern. The hesitation disappears. Not because the task becomes pleasant. Because it becomes familiar. You stop seeing it as something emotional. You start seeing it as something practical. Necessary. Part of the process. Which is exactly what your father wanted. Because a butcher who hesitates is a butcher who slows down. And a butcher who slows down loses money. And possibly fingers. So you adapt. Quickly. You learn to focus on the task, not the moment. On the motion, not the meaning. Because thinking about it too much doesn't help. It just makes the job harder. And harder is something you don't need more of. By the end of the day, you are tired. Not just physically. Something else. Something quieter. But by the next morning, you wake up. And do it again. Because that's the real lesson. Not how to do it once, but how to do it again, without thinking about it too much. At some point, you realize something important. Speed matters more than almost anything else. Not skill, not strength. Speed. Because meat does not wait. It does not politely stay fresh while you figure things out. It changes. Quickly. And if you don't keep up with it, it becomes a problem. A very expensive problem. There is no refrigeration. No safe storage. No, I'll deal with this tomorrow. Tomorrow is where things go wrong. So you learn to move. Fast. Not in a rushed, chaotic way. In a precise way. Every movement becomes efficient. Cut. Move. Clean. Repeat. There is no wasted motion. Because wasted motion turns into wasted time. And wasted time turns into spoiled meat. Which turns into lost money. Which turns into your father looking at you in a way that does not require explanation. You develop a rhythm. Not because it's satisfying. Because it's necessary. The work becomes almost mechanical. Your hands know what to do before you fully think about it, which is helpful, because thinking slows you down, and slowing down is not an option. At the same time, you are surrounded by things that can go wrong. Knives that don't forgive mistakes. Surfaces that are never stable. Fluids that make everything slippery at exactly the wrong moment. You are moving quickly, in an environment that would strongly prefer you didn't, which means you are constantly balancing two priorities. Speed, and not injuring yourself, which is harder than it sounds, because the faster you move, the easier it is to make a mistake. And mistakes here are not minor. They are memorable, immediately. So you learn control, not just speed. Controlled speed, the ability to move quickly without losing awareness, without slipping, without missing, without thinking. I'll fix that later, because later doesn't exist. Only now, always now. And then there's the pressure. Customers are waiting. Your father is watching. The day is moving whether you keep up or not. There is no pause button, no break where everything stops so you can catch up. If you fall behind, everything piles up, literally, so you don't fall behind. You push forward, faster, cleaner, sharper, more precise, until one day you notice something strange. You're not struggling anymore. You're keeping pace, which should feel like an achievement. Instead, it just feels like the minimum requirement. Because in this job, being fast isn't impressive. It's survival. And anything slower than that doesn't last very long. At some point, something changes. Not in your work. in your awareness, because the smell disappears. Not literally. It's still there, strong, persistent, possibly evolving in ways science has not yet documented. But you stop noticing it completely. It fades into the background of your life, like the sound of rain or the feeling of your own clothes, which feels like progress, until you leave the shop and realize it hasn't gone anywhere. You carry it everywhere. On your clothes, on your hands, in your hair, possibly in ways that feel unfair. You walk through the street and people react. Again, not dramatically. No one runs, no one screams. But there's a pattern, a step back, a slightly faster pace when passing you, a polite but very short conversation. You are not avoided openly. You are avoided efficiently. And this is where it becomes clear. You don't just work as a butcher. You smell like one, constantly, which creates a small but consistent problem. You are easy to identify in any crowd, from a distance, possibly with your eyes closed, which does not help your social life. Conversations are shorter. Interactions are more practical. People come to you for one reason, meet. They do not stay for discussion. They do not linger for atmosphere, because your atmosphere is memorable. You notice it most when you try to step outside your role, go somewhere else, stand near people who are not used to your world, and suddenly you are aware of the space around you, the small gap people maintain, the way they angle slightly away, the way they try to be polite while also finishing the interaction quickly. It's not personal, it's sensory, which somehow makes it worse, because you can't fix it. Washing helps, a little, for a while, but the work comes back every day, and so does the smell. Which means this is not something you leave at the shop. It follows you, quietly, consistently, like a second identity. And over time, you stop trying to separate the two, because it's exhausting. Instead, you accept it. This is part of the job, not just what you do, what you carry, what people associate with you. And eventually, you notice something else. You no longer care as much, because when something becomes constant, it stops feeling like a problem, and starts feeling like normal, even if everyone else still disagrees. By now, you understand something important. You are necessary, but not welcome. People come to your shop every day. They need meat. They rely on you. Their meals depend on what you do, which should make you respected, appreciated, maybe even popular. It does not, because while people value what you provide, they do not enjoy the experience of being near you. Your shop is loud, wet, smells like decisions that cannot be undone. There are sounds people would rather not hear, visuals people would rather not see, and a general atmosphere that does not encourage casual conversation. So customers develop a system. They arrive. They state what they want. They wait. They leave. Efficient, focused, minimal interaction. No unnecessary questions. No lingering. No, how's your day going? Because everyone already knows how your day is going, and they don't need details. Some customers don't even look directly at what you're doing. They keep their eyes slightly above the work, focused on you, not the process, as if acknowledging the process might somehow make it more real, which is understandable, because your job sits in that uncomfortable space between necessity and reality. Everyone eats meat. Very few people want to think about how it becomes meat. You are the person who makes that transition visible, and people prefer that transition to stay invisible, so they treat you carefully, not rudely, not openly disrespectfully, just with a quiet distance. You notice it in small ways, the way they stand a little farther back, the way they take the product without touching your hand, the way they leave immediately after paying, as if the door might close behind them permanently. And then there's the irony. These same people will complain if the meat isn't good, if the cut isn't right, if something feels off, because they expect quality. They rely on it. They just don't want to be reminded of the process behind it, which puts you in a strange position. You are essential, but not admired, respected for what you provide, but avoided for how you provide it. And there's not much you can do about it. You can't make the job cleaner. You can't make it quieter. You can't make it pleasant. So you adapt. You keep interactions short. You focus on the transaction. You give people exactly what they came for. Nothing more. Nothing less. Because in this business, relationships are simple. They need you. You provide. And everyone quietly agrees not to think too much about it. At this point, you might assume your job is chaotic, messy, loud, uncontrolled. And it is. But here's the surprising part. It is also heavily regulated. Because in the Middle Ages, meat is not just food. It is risk. If you sell bad meat, people get sick. If people get sick, people get angry. And when enough people get angry, authorities get involved. Very quickly. So despite everything looking slightly improvised, there are rules. A lot of them. Guilds oversee your work. Local officials inspect it. Prices are sometimes controlled. Quality is monitored, which means you are not just dealing with animals and customers. You are dealing with expectations. Constant ones. You cannot just cut meat however you want. There are standards, specific cuts, proper handling, acceptable freshness, which is a very optimistic concept in a world without refrigeration. You are expected to sell meat quickly. You are expected not to mix fresh meat with older meat. You are expected not to cheat customers, which, given the environment, might feel like an ambitious request. Inspections happen, not always regularly, but often enough to matter. And when they do, you cannot argue. You cannot negotiate. If something is wrong, it is wrong. And the consequences are not subtle. Fines, confiscation of goods, public punishment, which in a medieval town is not just about money. It's about reputation. And reputation is everything, because word travels fast, faster than you'd like. If people start to believe your meat is bad, they stop coming. And if they stop coming, you don't just lose business, you lose survival. So you follow the rules, even when they are inconvenient, even when they slow you down, even when they feel slightly unrealistic given the conditions you're working in, because the alternative is worse. At the same time, there's pressure from another direction. Competition. Other butchers are watching. Customers are comparing. And if you make mistakes, they benefit. So you are balancing everything at once. Speed, cleanliness, accuracy, reputation, regulation, all in an environment that is already working against you. And the strangest part? Customers assume this is simple. They walk in, point, pay, and leave. They don't see the system behind it. The rules, the pressure, the constant need to get everything exactly right. In a place where almost nothing is easy to control. Because in this job, one mistake is not just a mistake. It's a problem. And problems don't stay small for long, especially when people are eating your work. By now, you understand something very clearly. There is no such thing as done. Not in this job. Not even close. Because just when you think you've finished cleaning, you haven't. You never have. The work creates mess. Constantly. Blood on the floor. On the table. On your tools. On your hands. On things you don't remember touching. Water spreads it around instead of removing it. Straw absorbs some of it, but not enough. Everything is either wet or becoming wet. And your job is to manage that. Not eliminate it. Because elimination is not an option. You scrub floors that will look the same again in minutes. You wash tools that will be used again immediately. You clear waste that is already being replaced by new waste. It's not cleaning. It's containment. Temporary containment. You develop routines. Where to throw water. Where to step. Where not to step. Which areas are slightly less terrible than others. You learn to move through the space without thinking too much about it. Because thinking about it makes it worse. Much worse. And then there's disposal. Things need to go somewhere. Waste doesn't just disappear. It gets carried out. Dumped, moved, sometimes too close to where people live, which leads to complaints, understandable ones, because while you've adapted to the smell, everyone else has not. So now you're dealing with a second layer of pressure, not just keeping things under control inside your shop, but making sure the outside doesn't become a problem, which it often does anyway. Animals attract attention, not the good kind, flies, stray animals, things that arrive uninvited and refuse to leave, and they make everything worse, faster. So you work harder, you clean more, you try to stay ahead of something that doesn't stop. And at some point, you realize the truth. You are not cleaning to make things clean. You are cleaning to make things acceptable. Just enough. Just barely. Just enough that customers don't walk away. Just enough that inspectors don't shut you down. Just enough that the situation remains manageable. And that becomes the goal. Not perfection. Not even improvement. Maintenance. Endless maintenance. Because in this job, the mess isn't a problem you solve. It's a condition you live with. And no matter how much effort you put in, it's always waiting, right behind you, ready to start again. By now you've accepted the smell, the mess, the work. What you haven't fully accepted yet is the risk. Because everything around you can go wrong. Not dramatically, quietly, which is worse. You work with animals. You work with blood. You work with tools that are sharp enough to solve problems instantly and create new ones just as fast. And the environment you work in, it is not forgiving. Cuts happen, small ones. At first, a slip of the hand, a moment of distraction, a tool that moves faster than you expected. You look down, and there it is. Nothing serious, just a cut. You rinse it, wrap it, keep working, because stopping is not really an option. And this is where things become dangerous. Because a small cut in your world is not just a small cut. It's an opening, and everything around you would very much like to enter. You don't know about bacteria, not in the way modern people do, but you understand something. Infection happens. You've seen it. A wound that doesn't heal, a hand that swells, a fever that appears slowly and then doesn't leave. And once it starts, there's not much you can do. No antibiotics, no reliable treatment, just hope. And hope is not a strategy. So you become careful, very careful. You watch your hands, you watch your movements, you avoid unnecessary risks. But here's the problem. Your entire job is risk. You are working fast, in a wet environment, surrounded by sharp tools, handling things that are not exactly clean, which means even when you're careful, you're still exposed. And then there's the other side of it, not just your health, the customers. Because if something goes wrong with the meat, it doesn't just affect you, it affects everyone who buys from you. People get sick, and when people get sick, they don't blame the system. They blame you, immediately. So now you're managing two kinds of danger. What happens to you, and what happens because of you, both equally serious, both always present. Which means every day you work, you are balancing something invisible, not just speed, not just skill, but risk. Constant quiet risk. And you don't think about it too much. Because if you do, it becomes harder to continue. So instead, you focus on the work, the routine, the next task. Because in this job, survival isn't just about earning money. It's about getting through the day without something going wrong and hoping that tomorrow feels exactly the same. By now, you might think your biggest problems are the smell, the mess, or the risk. They are not. Your biggest problem is the butcher down the street, because you are not the only one doing this job. And in a medieval town, that means one thing. Every customer you have can go somewhere else, which creates a very specific kind of pressure. Not loud, not obvious, but constant. Other butchers are watching, not openly, not standing outside your shop taking notes, but they notice things. Who comes to you? How often they come, whether they leave satisfied or slightly disappointed. Because in this business, reputation spreads faster than anything else, faster than smell. And that's saying something. If your meat is good, people talk. If your meat is bad, people talk more. If your meat makes someone sick, you don't just lose a customer, you lose trust. And trust, once gone, does not come back easily. So you pay attention to everything. The quality of your cuts, the freshness of your product, the way you present it, even the way you speak to customers. Because while they may not enjoy being near you, they still remember how you treated them. And then there's pricing. You can't just charge whatever you want. If you're too expensive, people leave. If you're too cheap, people get suspicious. Because cheap meat raises questions. Uncomfortable questions. So you stay in the middle. Competitive. Careful. Always aware that someone else is trying to do the same thing. Possibly better. And unlike you, they might not have made a mistake recently. Which matters. Because one mistake is all it takes. One bad batch. One unhappy customer. One rumor that starts quietly and spreads quickly. And suddenly people are choosing someone else. Not because they like them more, because they trust them more. And trust is fragile, especially in a job where people already feel uneasy. So you work harder, not just to do your job, but to maintain your position, to stay relevant, to stay chosen. Because this is not a profession where loyalty is guaranteed. Customers come to you because they need you, but they stay with you because you prove every single day that you are the better option. And if you stop proving that, someone else will. By now, something has changed. Not in the work, in you, because there is only so long a person can do this job while thinking about what they're actually doing. And you've reached that limit. At first, everything felt intense. The smell, the sounds. The first time you held a blade and realized what it was meant to do, your mind reacted, questioned, hesitated. Now, it doesn't. Not because the job became easier, because you adapted. You had to. Because if you kept reacting to every detail, every sound, every movement, every moment, you wouldn't last long. So you stop thinking about it. Not completely. Just enough. You shift your focus from meaning to process, from emotion to routine. You no longer see an animal. You see steps, position, movement, cut. Next, everything becomes a sequence. Predictable, repeatable, manageable, which is exactly what your mind needs. Because unpredictability makes the job harder. Routine makes it possible. And once you develop that routine, something else happens. You become efficient, not just physically, mentally. You don't hesitate. You don't question. You move from one task to the next without pausing long enough to think, should I be doing this? Because that question is not helpful, and helpful is what matters. But there's a trade-off. Because while you gain efficiency, you lose something else. Distance. The kind that lets you see the job from the outside. The kind that makes other people react the way they do. That distance disappears. And with it, your awareness of how unusual this life actually is. You stop noticing what others notice. You stop reacting the way others would react. Because to you, this is no longer strange. It's normal, which is necessary, but also permanent. Because once you adjust to something like this, you don't easily go back. You don't suddenly wake up one day and think, this is not for me. You think, this is what I do. And that becomes your identity, not just your work. Because in this job, survival doesn't come from strength, or even skill. It comes from adaptation, the ability to stop thinking about things that would otherwise stop you from continuing. And once you learn that, you don't just do the job, you become someone who can. There are moments in medieval life that feel different. Festivals, feasts, religious celebrations, days where the town comes alive, people gather, and everything feels slightly more enjoyable for everyone else. For you, these days mean one thing: work, more work, much more work. Because when people celebrate, they eat. A lot. And when they eat, they need meat. Which means they need you. But not at your normal pace. At double. Sometimes more. Orders increase. Demand rises. Customers arrive earlier, stay longer, and expect everything to be ready, fresh, plentiful, perfect. Which is an interesting expectation, given your working conditions. Animals arrive in greater numbers. The noise increases. The speed increases. Everything becomes louder, faster, and more intense. There is no gradual build-up. It's immediate, and it doesn't stop. You move constantly, from one task to the next. No pause. No break. Because falling behind during a festival is not an option. People are waiting, and they are not patient. This is not a normal day where a delay is acceptable. This is a celebration. Expectations are higher. Tolerance is lower. If something goes wrong, if you run out, if the quality drops, if you slow down, people notice. Immediately. And they remember, which matters. Because these moments affect your reputation more than any ordinary day. At the same time, the environment becomes even more difficult. More animals means more mess, more waste, more pressure. Everything you already deal with, multiplied. And while the rest of the town enjoys the atmosphere, the food, the music, you are in the middle of it. Working, constantly. You might hear the celebration outside, distant sounds of people enjoying the results of your work. But you're not part of it. You're supporting it, which is not the same thing. And at some point, usually late in the day when everything starts to slow down, you notice something. You're exhausted, more than usual. Because this wasn't just a long day, it was a demanding one. And tomorrow, you don't rest. You clean. Because everything that happened today left a mark, a very visible one. Which means the celebration ends for everyone else. But for you, it just changes form. Because in this job, even the best days are still work. At first, you don't notice it. You're young. You're strong. You move quickly, lift easily, recover overnight. A long day feels like just a long day. But time has a way of quietly changing things. And your job is very good at reminding you of that. Because this is not light work. Nothing about it is. You lift weight constantly. Animals, tools, buckets, parts that don't exactly organize themselves neatly. You stand for hours. On floors that are not comfortable, not stable, not forgiving. You move in ways that are repetitive. The same motions. Again, and again, and again. Which doesn't feel like a problem at first. Until it is. Your hands feel it first. Small aches. Stiffness. Cuts that take a little longer to heal. Then your arms. Your shoulders. Your back. Always your back. Because lifting is constant. And proper technique is not something anyone really teaches. You just do it. Until your body starts reminding you that maybe there was a better way. But it's too late for that now. So you keep working. Because stopping is not an option. You can't take a day off easily. You can't rest for long. The work is still there, waiting. And if you don't do it, it doesn't disappear. It gets worse. So you push through it every day. Ignoring discomfort becomes part of the routine, just like everything else. And then there are the injuries. Not dramatic ones. Those are rare. It's the small ones that matter. The ones that don't stop you, but stay with you. A cut that heals badly. A joint that never quite feels the same. A muscle that reminds you every morning that it exists. You learn to work around them. Adjust. Compensate. Because you don't have a choice. And over time, your body changes. Not visibly at first. But internally, you feel it. The difference between who you were when you started and who you are now. Stronger in some ways. more worn in others. And there's a quiet understanding that grows with it. This job takes from you, not all at once, but gradually, day by day, task by task, until one day you realize something simple. You're not just working the job is working on you, constantly, and there's no way to pause it, no way to slow it down. You just keep going, because that's what you've always done, and stopping isn't part of the routine. At some point, something subtle happens. You stop being introduced by your name and start being known by your role. The butcher, not the son of, not the man who lives near the square, just the butcher, which sounds simple, almost practical, until you realize what it means. Because this is no longer just your job, it's your identity. People don't think about what you might do outside of work. They don't imagine your hobbies. They don't wonder what you enjoy. They associate you with one thing: meat and everything that comes with it. The smell, the shop, the work, the reality of it. And once that association is fixed, it doesn't change. You walk through the market and people recognize you, not always by your face, by your presence, by what you represent. And interactions become predictable, short, functional, focused. You are respected in a very specific way. People understand your role. They rely on it. But that respect has limits. You are not invited into every space, not included in every conversation, because you carry your work with you, even when you're not working. And then there's something else. Your own perception begins to shift. You stop thinking of yourself as separate from the job. You don't say, "I work as a butcher." You think, "I'm a butcher," because the work fills your day, your time, your energy, your environment. There is very little left outside of it. And over time, that becomes normal, not restrictive, just how things are. You know your place in the town, where you fit, what people expect from you, and what they don't. And you adjust, quietly, without questioning it too much. Because questioning it doesn't change anything. It just makes it harder to accept. So you lean into it. You do your job. You fulfill your role. You become reliable, consistent, recognizable, which in a medieval town is a kind of stability. But it comes at a cost, because once your identity becomes your work, there's very little space left for anything else. And in this case, your work is not something you can leave behind at the end of the day. It follows you, defines you, and eventually, it becomes the only way people see you, which is efficient, but not exactly personal. By now, there are no surprises left. No new realizations. No moment where everything suddenly makes sense. Because this is it. This is your life. You wake up early, not because you enjoy mornings, because the work is already waiting. Animals arrive. Tools are prepared. The day begins before you're fully ready for it. And once it starts, it doesn't slow down. You move through the same rhythm you've learned over years. Cut, carry, clean, repeat. There is comfort in that rhythm. Not because it's pleasant, because it's familiar. You don't need to think about what comes next. You already know, which makes the day manageable. Even when it's long, even when it's difficult. Customers come and go. Quick interactions. Short conversations. The same patterns repeated again and again. You provide what they need. They leave. And the cycle continues. The smell is still there. Of course it is. It always is. But you stopped noticing it a long time ago. The work is still demanding. Your body still feels it. But that too has become normal. Everything that once felt intense now feels expected. And that's the strange part. Nothing about this job has become easier. You've just become used to it, which is not the same thing. But it works. Because in a world where survival depends on consistency, getting used to something is often the only way to continue. There are moments sometimes when you step back, brief ones, where you notice the repetition, the years passing, the fact that today looks very similar to yesterday, and tomorrow will look very similar to today. But those moments don't last, because there is always something to do, always another task, another responsibility, another reason to keep moving. And eventually, even those thoughts fade, replaced by routine, because routine is easier, simpler, safer. And so you continue, day after day, year after year, doing work that people rely on, but prefer not to think about. You are essential. That never changes. But you are also distant, from others, from comfort, from anything that doesn't fit into the rhythm of your work. And in the end, that's what defines it. Not the difficulty, not the smell, not even the danger, but the repetition. The quiet understanding that this is not something you step away from, it's something you live, completely, until one day, without much notice, it simply becomes everything. In the dim glow of candlelight, the Victorian world developed a rather elegant solution to grief. Invite the dead back for a conversation. Not metaphorically, literally. Chairs were arranged, curtains drawn, and respectable citizens gathered in silence, waiting for a table to knock or a spirit to politely make its presence known. It was somehow both eerie and socially acceptable. This wasn't fringe behaviour. Seances became a full-blown trend, especially among the middle and upper classes. If you had a decent house, a circle of curious friends, and at least one person willing to claim they could hear whispers from the beyond, you were essentially hosting the Victorian version of a dinner party. Except one of your guests might be deceased. The timing explains a lot. The 19th century was drowning in death. Disease, poor medical knowledge, and high infant mortality meant almost every family had lost someone. Grief wasn't rare, it was expected, and science, despite all its progress, wasn't offering much comfort. Knowing how electricity worked didn't make losing your child any easier, so people looked elsewhere. Spiritualism stepped in and made a bold promise. Death is not the end, and with the right conditions, you can prove it. No need for blind faith. This was presented almost like an experiment. Sit still, hold hands, ask questions, wait for a response. If the table tapped once, it meant yes, twice no. Simple. Scientific, in a way that would make actual scientists deeply uncomfortable. And then there were the mediums, usually young women, often seen as more sensitive or spiritually open. Conveniently so. They became the centerpiece of these gatherings, entering trances, delivering messages, sometimes even adopting the voices of the dead. One moment you were in your living room. The next you were apparently speaking to your late uncle, who, surprisingly, had opinions about your life choices. Of course, not everyone was convinced. Even at the time, skepticism lingered in the background like an uninvited guest. But that didn't stop the movement from growing. If anything, the mystery made it more appealing. Because here's the truth. When you miss someone enough, you don't need perfect evidence. You just need the possibility that they're still there, somewhere in the darkness, waiting for you to listen. As seances grew in popularity, a new kind of celebrity emerged within Victorian society, the medium. These individuals, often portrayed as fragile, sensitive, and spiritually gifted, became the centerpiece of any gathering that dared to reach beyond the veil. And in a world already obsessed with science, curiosity, and the unknown, mediums offered something irresistible, a living experiment in the supernatural. Most mediums were women. This wasn't entirely accidental. Victorian society restricted women's roles in public life, but spiritualism quietly opened a door. A young woman who might otherwise be expected to remain silent could now command a room, speak with authority, and claim connection to forces no man could control. It was, in a strange way, one of the few socially acceptable forms of power available to them. During seances, these mediums would enter trance-like states. Their voices might change, their posture shift, their expressions become distant, as if something else had taken hold. Some claimed to channel specific spirits, delivering personal messages to grieving families. Others produced physical phenomena, knocks from inside walls, objects moving on their own, or ghostly hands appearing briefly in the darkness before vanishing again. Conveniently, all of this tended to happen when the lights were low enough to hide the details. Of course, not everyone was convinced. While believers leaned forward in awe, skeptics leaned back with narrowed eyes. The Victorian era was also an age of rational inquiry, and many began to suspect that these performances relied less on spirits and more on clever tricks. Hidden wires, secret compartments, and practiced sleight of hand could explain a surprising number of miracles. Some mediums were eventually exposed as frauds, caught mid-performance with suspicious tools or suspiciously flexible definitions of truth. And yet exposure didn't kill the movement. It only made it more fascinating, because for every fraud uncovered, there remained countless experiences that people swore were real. A message no one else could have known, a voice that sounded unmistakably familiar, a presence that felt undeniable. So the question lingered in every candlelit room. Were mediums deceivers, or pioneers of something science simply hadn't caught up with yet? In Victorian society, the answer depended less on evidence and more on what you were desperate enough to believe. If mediums were the stars of the séance, then the table was their most loyal accomplice. It sat quietly at the centre of the room, ordinary, unassuming, until suddenly it wasn't. Hands would rest lightly on its surface, fingers barely touching, and after a tense stretch of silence, a knock. Then another, and just like that, the dead were apparently in the room. This phenomenon, known as table turning or table tapping, became one of the most popular séance practices in Victorian society. It required no elaborate equipment, no special training, just a table, a few participants, and a willingness to interpret every creak as something meaningful. 1 knock for yes, 2 for no, a series of taps to spell out letters. It was simple, interactive, and incredibly effective at pulling people in. Because once the table moved, even slightly, it changed everything. Participants would swear they weren't pushing it. Everyone insisted their hands were still, barely applying pressure. And yet the table tilted, rotated, sometimes even lifted a leg off the ground. The room would grow tense, breaths held, as if any sudden movement might scare the spirit away. In reality, the only thing being carefully managed was the illusion. Skeptics later pointed to something called the ideomotor effect. Tiny, unconscious movements made by participants without realizing it. In other words, people weren't lying when they said they weren't moving the table. They genuinely believed it. Their own bodies were betraying them in ways too subtle to notice. But in a dark room, filled with expectation and emotion, subtlety feels like proof. Beyond the table, other objects joined the performance. Bells would ring without visible cause. Floors creaked in deliberate patterns. Occasionally, messages would appear, written, tapped, or whispered, seemingly from nowhere. Each small event built upon the last, layering coincidence into something that felt like communication. And once someone believed, truly believed, it spread quickly. One convinced participant could influence the entire room. Doubt became awkward. Skepticism felt almost rude. After all, if someone thought they were speaking to a lost loved one, who wanted to be the person saying, "It's probably just your hand pushing the table"? So the room listened. The table spoke, and somewhere between silence and suggestion, the line between the living and the dead grew just thin enough to feel real. As seances filled parlours with whispers and tapping tables, another invention stepped quietly into the world, one that seemed far more convincing than a knock in the dark. Photography, cold, mechanical, precise, a machine that captured reality, or so people believed. And soon it would begin capturing ghosts. Victorians trusted the camera in a way they didn't trust human testimony. A photograph, after all, couldn't lie. It recorded what was there, which made it the perfect tool for something extraordinary. Proof of the afterlife. Enter spirit photography. Clients would sit stiffly in studios, dressed in their finest clothes, staring into the lens. The exposure would take several seconds, long enough for something unusual to appear. And when the photograph was developed, there it was, a faint figure behind the subject, a pale face hovering near their shoulder, sometimes a full misty body draped in white, gazing directly at the camera as if it had been there all along. For grieving families, this wasn't just intriguing. It was everything. Imagine losing someone you loved, and then being handed an image that seemed to prove they were still beside you, still watching, still present. You didn't need perfect clarity. You just needed enough resemblance to believe, and photographers were more than willing to provide it. One of the most famous figures in this strange profession was William H. Mumler, a man who built an entire career on capturing these ghostly companions. His clients included ordinary citizens, and even prominent figures who desperately wanted one more connection to the dead. His photographs spread quickly, fueling both fascination and controversy, because of course there was a catch. To skeptics, spirit photography looked suspiciously like trickery. Double exposures, where 2 images are layered onto the same plate, could easily produce ghostly figures, faint outlines, blurred shapes, semi-transparent faces, all achievable with careful technique and just enough artistic ambiguity. What believers saw as evidence, critics saw as clever manipulation. Eventually, Mumler himself was taken to court, accused of fraud. The trial became a spectacle, with experts arguing over whether these images were genuine or fabricated. In the end, he was acquitted, not because his work was proven real, but because it couldn't be definitively disproven. And that uncertainty was all the movement needed. Because in the Victorian mind, a blurred face in the background wasn't a flaw. It was exactly what a ghost should look like. As seances became more theatrical and mediums more controversial, a new kind of participant entered the scene, the investigator. Not content with simply believing or dismissing, these individuals wanted answers, real ones. And so, in the flickering overlap between science and superstition, the Victorian ghost clubs were born. These weren't secret cults or shadowy societies whispering in basements. Quite the opposite. Many members were educated, well-respected, and deeply invested in the scientific progress of their time. Doctors, writers, philosophers, people who spent their days grounded in logic, found themselves gathering at night to ask a very uncomfortable question. What if some of this is actually real? One of the most notable organizations to emerge from this curiosity was the Society for Psychical Research, founded in the late 19th century. Unlike casual séance circles, this group approached the supernatural with structure. They documented cases, interviewed witnesses, tested mediums, and attempted to separate genuine phenomena from outright fraud, or at least that was the goal. Members of these clubs would travel to allegedly haunted locations, old manor houses, abandoned estates, quiet country homes where strange occurrences had been reported. They came armed not with crosses or charms, but with notebooks, measuring tools, and a firm belief that if something supernatural existed, it could be studied. Investigations often began in silence. Lights dimmed. Observers stationed in different parts of the house. Every sound noted. Every movement questioned. If a door creaked open, was it a draft or something else? If footsteps echoed down a hallway, was it the settling of the building, or a presence moving unseen? It sounds methodical, rational, almost modern. And yet, even these investigators weren't immune to the atmosphere. Long nights, isolation, and the constant expectation of something happening began to wear on the mind. Small noises felt louder. Shadows seemed to shift. The line between observation and imagination blurred, just as it had in the séance rooms. Even the most skeptical members occasionally reported experiences they couldn't easily explain, which created a strange tension at the heart of these clubs. They set out to debunk the supernatural, but sometimes they left with more questions than answers. Because when you go looking for ghosts with a candle in one hand and logic in the other, you don't always get to choose which one guides you home. Once ghost clubs began taking their work seriously, Victorian society did what it always did best. It turned curiosity into spectacle. Reports of hauntings spread quickly through newspapers, letters, and word of mouth, transforming quiet country homes into destinations of fascination. If a house was rumoured to be haunted, it didn't stay private for long. It became a case. One of the most talked about investigations involved the eerie disturbances at Borley Rectory, later called the most haunted house in England. Visitors and investigators alike claimed to hear footsteps echoing through empty halls, see shadowy figures moving behind windows, and witness objects shifting without explanation. Messages allegedly appeared on walls, written in a desperate, almost frantic hand. The story grew with every retelling, each version slightly more unsettling than the last. For ghost clubs, cases like this were irresistible. Teams would arrive with a mix of excitement and determination, ready to document everything. They set up controlled watches, sometimes spending entire nights awake, recording even the smallest detail. Windows were checked for drafts, floors inspected for loose boards, servants questioned, and witnesses interviewed repeatedly to catch inconsistencies. Because by this point, everyone knew the truth. Many hauntings had very human explanations: loose pipes, shifting foundations, pranksters seeking attention, or simply the mind playing tricks in the dark. Victorian investigators were not naive. They expected deception. In fact, they often assumed it. And yet, not everything could be neatly explained. Some reports came from multiple witnesses who described the same figure independently. Others involved sounds or movements that occurred under controlled conditions, where trickery seemed unlikely. Even when explanations were proposed, they often felt incomplete, as if something essential had been missed. This is where things became complicated, because the more these elite investigators tried to apply logic, the more they encountered moments that resisted it. Not outright proof of ghosts, but enough uncertainty to keep the question alive. Enough to make even a hardened skeptic pause before dismissing everything outright. And for the public, that was more than enough. A haunting didn't need to be proven. It only needed to remain unresolved. Because in the Victorian imagination, a mystery left open was far more powerful than one neatly explained. By the late 19th century, the world of séances had grown crowded, not just with spirits, but with suspicion. For every glowing account of ghostly contact, there was an equally determined effort to expose it, and slowly, methodically, the cracks began to show. Magicians were among the first to step forward. Unlike scientists, they didn't need to theorize. They recognized the tricks immediately. Hidden wires, clever lighting, sleight of hand. These weren't supernatural forces, they were stage techniques. What mediums presented as otherworldly phenomena looked, to a trained illusionist, like a performance with a very convincing script. One of the most vocal critics was Harry Houdini, the legendary escape artist who dedicated much of his later life to exposing fraudulent mediums. He attended séances in disguise, carefully observing every movement, every detail, and more often than not, he found exactly what he expected: deception. Houdini didn't just accuse, he demonstrated. He recreated seances on stage, showing audiences how easily a table could appear to move, how ghostly hands could materialize in the dark, how voices could seem to come from nowhere. The same effects that had convinced grieving families could be reproduced with simple tools and careful timing. No spirits required, and the revelations didn't stop there. Some mediums were caught outright. Hidden compartments were discovered in seance rooms. Assistants were exposed, secretly producing sounds or moving objects under cover of darkness. Even spirit voices were revealed to be ventriloquism, nothing more than a skilled manipulation of sound. For skeptics, this was confirmation. The entire movement, they argued, was built on illusion and exploitation. But belief doesn't disappear just because it's challenged. For many Victorians, exposure created an uncomfortable divide. Yes, some mediums were frauds, but surely not all of them. Surely there were genuine cases hidden among the deception. After all, people had experienced things they couldn't explain. They had felt something, heard something, seen something. And emotion doesn't surrender easily to logic. So the movement split in two directions. On one side, growing skepticism, armed with evidence and demonstration. On the other, unwavering belief, strengthened not by proof, but by personal experience. Because once you think you've heard a voice from the dead, no amount of explanation feels quite strong enough to silence it. By the end of the Victorian era, something unusual had happened. The supernatural had not been pushed out by science. It had been pulled into it. Seances were no longer just parlour entertainment or private acts of grief. They had become questions, hypotheses, something to be tested, measured and, if possible, understood. Respected thinkers began to take an interest. Not all of them believed, but many were unwilling to dismiss the phenomenon entirely. Among them was William Crookes, a prominent scientist who applied experimental methods to the study of mediums. He observed seances, recorded results, and even claimed to witness physical manifestations that he could not easily explain. For believers, this was validation. If a man of science took it seriously, then surely there must be something there. But for skeptics, it was troubling, because science relies on repeatability, control, and evidence that can be independently verified. Seances, on the other hand, thrived on unpredictability. Results were inconsistent. Phenomena appeared when least expected, and often disappeared under strict observation. The very conditions that made spiritual experiences feel authentic also made them nearly impossible to test properly. Still, the effort continued. Devices were introduced into seance rooms. Scales to measure weight changes, electrical circuits to detect movement, early recording tools to capture sounds. Investigators tried to remove human bias, to isolate whatever force might be at work. They wanted to prove, or disprove, once and for all, whether something truly existed beyond the physical world. And yet the results remained frustratingly unclear. Some experiments suggested subtle anomalies, movements without visible cause, shifts that couldn't be easily explained. Others revealed nothing at all. The same medium might produce remarkable effects one night and fail completely the next. It was inconsistent, elusive, almost as if it resisted being studied, which raised an uncomfortable possibility. Not that the supernatural was real, but that the human mind itself was far more powerful and far less understood than anyone had realized. Suggestion, expectation, emotion. These forces could shape perception in ways that felt completely real. A sound becomes a voice, a shadow becomes a figure, a coincidence becomes a message. In trying to prove the existence of spirits, Victorian science may have uncovered something else entirely. Not a world beyond death, but a deeper, more complicated world within the living mind. As the Victorian era faded into the 20th century, the candle-lit seances grew quieter, but they never truly disappeared. The tables stopped turning in fashionable drawing rooms. The mediums lost some of their influence, and science continued its steady march forward. And yet, the question that haunted an entire generation refused to die, because it had never really been about proof. It had been about something far more human. The Victorians lived in a world of rapid change, industry rising, cities expanding, technology advancing at a pace that must have felt almost overwhelming. And in the middle of all that progress, death remained stubbornly constant, unpredictable, unavoidable, personal. Spiritualism didn't just offer answers, it offered comfort, a way to believe that those who were gone were not truly lost. Even as frauds were exposed and skepticism grew louder, the emotional core of the movement stayed intact. And in many ways it evolved. The fascination with ghosts didn't vanish, it shifted. What had once been a social ritual became entertainment, then research, then culture. The legacy of Victorian seances can still be seen today in paranormal investigations, ghost hunting shows, and late-night stories told in hushed voices. The tools may have changed, cameras instead of candles, recordings instead of table taps, but the desire is exactly the same, to reach out and hope something answers. Modern paranormal groups, much like the old ghost clubs, continue to walk that same line between belief and skepticism. They gather evidence, debate explanations, and chase experiences that sit just beyond clear understanding. And just like their Victorian predecessors, they often leave with more questions than certainty. Because the truth is, the unknown has a kind of gravity. It pulls people in. And perhaps that's the real legacy of Victorian spiritualism. Not whether it proved the existence of ghosts, but that it revealed how deeply we want to believe in something beyond ourselves. Something that survives. Something that listens. Something that waits. So while the seances may have ended, the silence they left behind is still filled with possibility. And if you sit quietly enough, whether in a grand Victorian parlour or alone in the dark, you might understand why they kept asking the same question, again and again. Is anyone still there? Long before her name whispered through the halls of power, Locusta existed in the shadows, exactly where someone like her needed to be. Because in Rome, power wasn't just held in the Senate or on the battlefield. It was hidden in quieter places, in kitchens, in cups of wine, in the hands of someone who understood that death didn't always need a blade. Her origins are frustratingly unclear, which only adds to her legend. Most sources suggest she came from Gaul, a region Rome had conquered but never fully tamed. It was a land where knowledge of plants wasn't academic. It was practical. People knew which herbs healed, which ones numbed pain, and which ones ended life altogether. And somewhere in that environment, Locusta began learning. Not as a scholar, not as a physician, but as something far more dangerous. Because there's a difference between knowing a plant is poisonous and knowing exactly how to use it. Too much and the victim dies instantly. Messy, obvious, suspicious. Too little and nothing happens. But the perfect amount, that's where skill becomes power. A slow illness, a gradual decline. Something that looks natural, inevitable, almost boring. And that's exactly what made poison so valuable in Rome. This was a society obsessed with control, reputation, and inheritance. Killing someone openly could spark revenge, scandal, or political chaos. But if a rival simply fell ill and never recovered, that was cleaner, acceptable, convenient. And behind that convenience there was always someone like Locusta. At first, she likely operated on the edges of society, selling remedies, offering discreet services, building a reputation in whispers rather than declarations. The kind of reputation that didn't spread through official records, but through quiet conversations. If you need something handled, there's a woman who knows how. And in a city like Rome, that kind of information travels fast. Because once people realize that death can be arranged carefully, quietly, without consequence, they don't stop at curiosity. They start seeing opportunities. Enemies become problems that can be solved. Obstacles become temporary, and people like Locusta stop being invisible. They become necessary. By the time her name began to circulate among the elite, she was no longer just a woman with knowledge of herbs. She was something far more valuable and far more dangerous. She was a solution. By the time Locusta began attracting attention in Rome, she was no longer operating in obscurity. Her reputation had shifted from rumour to resource. People no longer asked if she was capable. They asked how discreetly she could get the job done. And in a city like Rome, that distinction mattered. At first, her clients were likely minor figures, individuals with personal grievances, inheritance disputes, or inconvenient rivals. Quiet jobs, small-scale problems. The kind that didn't attract the attention of magistrates or emperors. But success in those circles had a way of opening doors. Each natural death, each unexplained illness, strengthened her credibility. Because reliability was everything. Anyone could attempt poison, few could do it well. Locusta understood something most amateurs didn't. The body tells a story. A sudden collapse invites questions. A slow decline writes its own explanation. Fever, weakness, confusion. Symptoms that blended seamlessly into the medical ignorance of the time. Roman physicians, for all their confidence, had limited understanding of disease, which meant a well-crafted poison didn't look like murder. It looked like fate, and that made her invaluable. But in Rome, being valuable was a dangerous position, because eventually, the wrong, or rather, the most powerful, people would take notice. Her rise brought her into contact with figures connected to the imperial court, where stakes were no longer personal, but political. Here, death wasn't about settling grudges, it was about shaping the future. Removing a rival could alter succession. Eliminating an obstacle could secure power for generations. And in that world, subtlety wasn't just preferred, it was required. It's likely during this phase that Locusta crossed an invisible line. She was no longer just a provider of services. She became a tool of influence, a quiet instrument used by those who couldn't afford to act openly, which meant she was no longer in control of her own position. Because once you prove useful to power, you don't simply walk away. You get pulled deeper. Every successful job raised her status, but also her risk. More powerful clients meant more dangerous secrets, and in a court filled with ambition, paranoia, and shifting alliances, knowing too much was just as deadly as any poison she created. Still, she continued, because in Rome, survival often meant choosing the most dangerous path and walking it carefully enough that no one noticed until it was too late. By the time Locusta entered the orbit of the imperial court, her life stopped being her own. Because the court of Nero was not just a place of power, it was a place of quiet, constant danger. Alliances shifted overnight. Loyalty was temporary, and survival depended on eliminating threats before they could eliminate you. And Nero had a problem. His stepbrother Britannicus was a living reminder that his claim to the throne was not uncontested. Younger, but with a stronger bloodline, Britannicus represented something Rome understood very well: legitimacy. As long as he lived, Nero's position was never entirely secure, which meant Britannicus had to die. Not publicly, not violently, that would cause unrest. What Nero needed was something quieter, something that looked natural, something that would raise no immediate suspicion. He needed Locusta. According to ancient sources, Locusta was summoned to prepare a poison specifically for this task. Not just any poison, but one carefully designed to work within a controlled setting. It had to act quickly enough to eliminate Britannicus, but not so dramatically that it would expose the act. Her first attempt, however, failed. The poison was too mild. Britannicus survived. For a moment, that mistake could have cost her everything. In Nero's court, failure was rarely forgiven. It was punished, harshly, and Locusta was punished. But here's where her story takes a darker turn. Instead of discarding her, Nero gave her another chance. Because even in failure, she had proven something. She could get close. She could operate where others couldn't. And that made her too valuable to simply eliminate. So under pressure, likely under threat, she refined her work. The second attempt was different. At a banquet, surrounded by witnesses, Britannicus was given a drink. Almost immediately he collapsed. His body convulsed, his breath failed, and within moments he was dead. Nero reportedly dismissed it as an epileptic seizure, a convenient explanation, in a time when medical knowledge was limited and easily manipulated. And just like that, a rival disappeared. The court moved on. The story was accepted. And Locusta? She had just proven her worth to the most dangerous man in Rome, which meant she was no longer just a poisoner. She was now part of the empire's inner machinery, where death wasn't an accident, but a decision. After the death of Britannicus, Locusta was no longer just useful. She was indispensable. In a court ruled by paranoia and ambition, she had delivered exactly what Nero needed: a clean removal, wrapped in plausible explanation. And in return, Nero did something that would have seemed unthinkable in a more stable world. He rewarded her, not quietly either. Locusta was granted protection, wealth, and, perhaps most dangerously, official recognition. Some accounts suggest she was given land and even pupils, effectively allowing her to train others in the art of poisoning. Imagine that for a moment. In the heart of the Roman Empire, a known poisoner was not only tolerated, but supported. Not hidden, but valued. Because in Nero's Rome, usefulness outweighed morality. With imperial backing, Locusta's position transformed completely. She was no longer operating in the shadows, relying on whispers and secrecy. She now had a place within the system itself. When a problem arose, political, personal, or inconvenient, there was a solution. And that solution had a name. But power in Rome was never stable. The same system that elevated someone could just as easily destroy them. And the higher you rose, the more visible and vulnerable you became. Locusta's success made her known, and being known meant being remembered. Not just by allies, but by enemies. Still, under Nero's protection, she continued her work. Poison became a quiet tool of control within the imperial circle. Rivals weakened, threats disappeared, and because these deaths were rarely dramatic, they slipped into the background of Roman life. A sudden illness here, an unexpected decline there, each one explained away, each one conveniently timed, and behind it all, Locusta remained. But here's the problem with being protected by someone like Nero. Your safety depends entirely on their power. As long as he ruled, she was untouchable. But if that power faltered, even slightly, everything would change. Because people like Locusta don't just carry out dangerous acts, they carry dangerous knowledge. And in Rome, knowledge like that doesn't retire peacefully. It gets erased. With Nero firmly on the throne and Locusta under his protection, the Roman court entered a phase where fear became the quiet language of power, not open violence. Rome had seen plenty of that, but something more controlled, more unsettling, the kind of fear that lingered in every shared meal, every cup of wine, every unexpected illness. Because now death didn't need witnesses. It could arrive unnoticed. Nero's rule grew increasingly unstable, shaped by paranoia and a constant need to secure his position. Rivals were no longer just political opponents. They were potential threats waiting to act. And in an environment like that, suspicion spreads quickly. A careless word, a rumoured alliance, even silence could be interpreted as disloyalty. And when suspicion rises, so does the demand for certainty. That's where Locusta's role became even more critical. She wasn't just removing individuals anymore. She was maintaining control. Each death sent a message, even if it was never officially acknowledged. Stay loyal, stay quiet, or risk becoming the next unexplained illness. It created a strange atmosphere within the elite circles of Rome. Publicly, everything remained composed. Banquets were held. Conversations continued. Smiles were exchanged. But beneath that surface, tension never fully disappeared. People watched what they ate. They paid attention to who served their food. Trust became something rare and dangerous, because trusting the wrong person could be fatal. Even those closest to Nero were not immune. Alliances in his court were temporary, built more on necessity than loyalty. Today's ally could become tomorrow's problem. And if that happened, solutions were readily available. Quietly, efficiently, irreversibly. For Locusta, this was both her peak and her greatest risk. She was at the center of power, operating where few others could. But that position came with a constant, unspoken reality. She knew too much. Every poison she prepared, every death she enabled, added to a list of secrets that could never safely exist outside Nero's control. And in a court driven by fear, secrets are never neutral. They are liabilities. Which meant that while Locusta helped create the atmosphere of control, she was also trapped within it. Protected, yes, but only as long as she remained useful. Because in Rome, usefulness was never permanent. And once it fades, fear doesn't protect you anymore. It turns against you. For years, Locusta had lived under the protection of a man who seemed untouchable. As long as Nero ruled, her position, however dangerous, was secure. But power in Rome was never permanent, and when it begins to crack, it doesn't collapse slowly. It collapses all at once. By the late years of Nero's reign, the empire had grown restless. His rule, once stabilized through fear and control, had become unpredictable. Extravagance, suspicion, and erratic decisions alienated even those who had once supported him. The Senate turned uneasy. The military began to waver. And in the provinces, rebellion started to take shape. One of the most decisive moments came with the uprising led by Gaius Julius Vindex, which signalled that opposition to Nero was no longer hidden. It was open. Soon after, another figure emerged, one far more dangerous, Servius Sulpicius Galba. A governor with military backing, Galba presented something Nero had not faced before, a legitimate alternative, and Rome, always pragmatic, began to shift. Support for Nero eroded quickly. Allies distanced themselves. The Praetorian Guard, once loyal, reconsidered their position, because in Rome, loyalty follows survival, and Nero no longer looked like the safer choice. In the middle of this unravelling stood Locusta. Her entire existence depended on Nero's power. Without him, she wasn't a protected asset. She was evidence, a living reminder of the methods used to maintain his rule. And in a city eager to move on, figures like her were not just inconvenient, they were dangerous. As Nero's control slipped, the protection around Locusta began to fade. The system that had once shielded her no longer functioned, and unlike senators or generals, she had no political leverage, no allies strong enough to defend her, because her power had never been her own. It had always belonged to Nero, and when he fled Rome, abandoned by almost everyone, that connection became a liability overnight. Soon after, facing capture and humiliation, Nero took his own life, bringing his reign to a sudden violent end. With him, the protection that had kept Locusta safe vanished completely. And in a Rome desperate to distance itself from the chaos of the past, there was no place left for someone like her. Because when a regime falls, it doesn't just remove the ruler, it erases the tools that kept him in power. With Nero gone, Rome moved quickly to cleanse itself of his legacy. The city had endured years of fear, suspicion, and quiet executions, and now it needed something else. Distance. A clear break from the past. And in times like these, justice often becomes less about fairness and more about symbolism. For Locusta, that shift was immediate. The protection that once made her untouchable had disappeared overnight. There were no more favours, no more imperial shields, no one willing to risk their own position to defend her. In fact, quite the opposite. The new regime needed figures like Locusta to stand trial, not just for what they had done, but for what they represented. Because her story was too useful to ignore. She was the perfect embodiment of Nero's rule, secretive, dangerous, and morally compromised. By punishing her, Rome could send a clear message. This is what happens to those who served the old order. It wasn't just about her crimes, it was about rewriting the narrative. And Locusta, for all her past power, had no way to resist. Accounts of her final days vary, but they all lead to the same outcome. She was arrested, publicly condemned, and sentenced to death under the authority of Servius Sulpicius Galba. Unlike the quiet deaths she had orchestrated, hers would not be subtle. There would be no ambiguity, no convenient explanation, only spectacle. Some sources suggest she was executed in a deliberately humiliating manner, dragged through the streets, exposed to public scorn before her death. Whether every detail is accurate or not almost doesn't matter. What matters is the intention behind it. This was not meant to be a clean ending. It was meant to be seen, because Rome needed closure. It needed to believe that the corruption of Nero's reign had been identified, contained, and destroyed. And executing Locusta helped create that illusion. But here's the irony. For years, she had been a tool, used by the powerful to remove threats without consequence. Now she had become something else entirely. A scapegoat. Her death didn't erase what had happened. It didn't undo the quiet poisonings, the political manipulations, the fear that had defined an era. It simply gave Rome a face to blame, and once that face was gone, the city could pretend it had moved on, even if the methods never truly disappeared. After the death of Locusta, Rome did what it often did best. It moved on, quickly and conveniently. The scandal faded, the names changed, and the empire continued forward, as if the darker methods of the past had been neatly buried along with her. But the truth is they weren't, because Locusta's story didn't end with her execution. It simply became quieter. Poison didn't disappear from Roman life. It remained one of the most effective and discreet tools of control. If anything, her existence proved just how useful it could be. The lesson wasn't never do this again. It was be more careful next time. Less visible, less traceable, more controlled. And that's exactly what happened. Future generations of elites, whether openly or in secret, understood the same principle Locusta had mastered. Power doesn't always come from strength. Sometimes it comes from subtlety, from knowing that the most effective action is the one no one can clearly prove. Her name, however, lingered. Writers and historians used Locusta as a symbol, a warning wrapped in a story. Not just of crime, but of how easily morality bends when it becomes useful. She was remembered not as a victim of circumstance, but as someone who embraced her role fully, someone who understood the system she lived in and chose to thrive within it. But even that memory is complicated, because Locusta didn't create the demand for poison. Rome did. She didn't invent political betrayal, ambition, or the need to eliminate rivals. She simply provided a service that powerful people were already seeking. In many ways, she was less an anomaly and more a reflection of the world around her, which raises an uncomfortable question. If Locusta had never existed, would anything really have been different? Someone else would have taken her place. Someone else would have learned the same skills, filled the same role, and operated under the same protection. Because in a system built on power and fear, tools like her are inevitable. So while Rome executed the poisoner, it never truly confronted the conditions that created her. And that might be the most lasting part of her legacy. Not the deaths she caused, but the realization that in the right environment someone like Locusta is not exceptional. She is simply inevitable. In the end, what makes Locusta so unsettling isn't just what she did, but how easily she fit into the world around her. Strip away the stories, the accusations, the dramatic endings, and you're left with something far more uncomfortable than a villain. You're left with a person who adapted. Because Rome was not a gentle place. It was a system built on hierarchy, ambition, and quiet brutality. People rose by removing obstacles. Families secured power through alliances, betrayals, and sometimes convenient deaths. Locusta didn't invent that system. She simply found her place within it and made herself indispensable. Which is why her story feels so modern. We tend to imagine figures like her as exceptions, as rare outliers who operated beyond the norms of society. But in reality, she was deeply connected to those norms. She worked for emperors, elites, and influential figures who relied on her skills. She wasn't hiding from the system. She was part of it. And that's what makes her difficult to categorize. Was she a criminal? Undoubtedly. A murderer? Almost certainly. But she was also a product of demand. A specialist in a service that powerful people were willing to protect, fund, and repeatedly use. Her survival depended on meeting those expectations, and for a time she did so perfectly, until the system no longer needed her. Because in Rome, loyalty was temporary, usefulness was conditional, and protection was never permanent. The same forces that elevated her eventually erased her, not because she had changed, but because the political landscape had. And that's the part most people overlook. Locusta didn't fall because she became dangerous. She had always been dangerous. She fell because the people who benefited from her skills were gone, replaced by others who needed distance from the past. So her story ends the way many in Rome did, not with redemption, not with justice, but with removal. Clean. Finale. Convenient. And yet, centuries later, her name still lingers. Not because we know everything about her, we don't, but because she represents something timeless. The quiet intersection of power, fear, and human ambition. The reminder that behind great empires and political decisions, there are always unseen hands shaping outcomes in ways history rarely records, and sometimes those hands carry poison. Long before it became one of the most famous wonders of the ancient world, the Colossus of Rhodes began as something far more practical, a symbol of survival. The island of Rhodes had just endured a major threat. In the early 3rd century before Christ, it faced a massive siege led by Demetrius the Thirst Poliorcetes, a ruler known for his relentless military campaigns and siege engines so advanced they seemed almost unstoppable. Towers rolled toward the city walls. Weapons thundered. The future of Rhodes hung in the balance. And yet, against all expectations, the city held. The siege failed. Demetrius withdrew. And in doing so, he left behind something unexpected: his abandoned war machines. Massive, expensive, and now useless, they became something else entirely. Opportunity. The Rhodians gathered the remains of the siege, metal, tools, and materials once meant to destroy them, and sold them. The profits were enormous, enough not just to rebuild, but to create something far more ambitious. They decided to build a monument. Not just any monument, a statement. It would honor Helios, the patron deity of Rhodes, believed to watch over the island and protect it. And it would be built on a scale that matched the significance of their victory, something that would be seen from afar, something that would remind every visitor, every trader, every rival, that Rhodes had stood its ground. And so the idea of the Colossus was born. But ideas are easy. Building a giant of bronze, visible across the harbour, was something else entirely. It required vision, resources, and above all, confidence. The kind of confidence only a city fresh from survival could possess. Because this wasn't just about art, it was about identity. The Rhodians weren't simply celebrating a victory, they were defining themselves, a people who could not be conquered, a city protected by the sun itself, and they would cast that belief into bronze, raising it high enough for the entire world to see. What they didn't yet know was how fragile even the greatest symbols can be. With the decision made, the people of Rhodes faced a problem far greater than any enemy army. How do you actually build a giant? Not a statue you place in a temple, not a monument you admire up close, but something enormous, something that would rise above the harbour and dominate the skyline, something that had never truly been attempted at this scale before. For that, they needed more than ambition. They needed a mind capable of turning imagination into structure. That responsibility fell to Chares of Lindos, a sculptor from Rhodes itself, and a student of the renowned Lysippos. This wasn't just any artist. Lysippos had been associated with the court of Alexander the Great, known for pushing the boundaries of proportion and realism. Chares inherited that tradition, but what he was about to attempt went far beyond refining the human form. He was about to scale it to impossible proportions. The vision was clear, a towering figure of Helios, standing tall as the guardian of Rhodes. But turning that vision into reality meant solving problems no one had fully solved before. How do you prevent such a massive structure from collapsing under its own weight? How do you shape bronze on a scale where even small miscalculations could mean disaster? The answer was patience and ingenuity. Construction began with a strong internal framework, likely made of iron and stone, forming the skeleton of the statue. Around this, bronze plates would be added, layer by layer, creating the outer form. But unlike smaller sculptures, this couldn't be built in a workshop and transported. It had to be constructed in place, rising slowly from the ground, which meant the statue didn't appear all at once. It grew. Workers built it section by section, using ramps and scaffolding that climbed alongside the structure as it rose higher and higher. From the feet upward, the Colossus took shape. First the legs, then the torso, then the arms and head. For years, the people of Rhodes watched their monument emerge, not as a finished marvel, but as a work in progress that seemed to challenge the limits of what humans could create. And with each new layer, the risk increased, because the higher it rose, the more fragile it became. But stopping was no longer an option. Because once you begin building a giant, you don't get to think small anymore. As the statue rose higher above Rhodes, it began to transform from an ambitious project into something almost unreal. What started as a foundation of stone and iron was now becoming a figure. Recognizable, human-like, yet impossibly large. The people of the island didn't just watch construction anymore. They watched a god being built. Under the direction of Chares of Lindos, every section was carefully planned. Yet the process itself remained slow and demanding. Bronze plates were shaped and fitted over the internal frame, hammered into place with precision. Each piece had to align perfectly, not just for appearance, but for stability. At this scale, even a slight imbalance could lead to catastrophic failure. And yet, it held. Day by day, the Colossus grew taller, its legs anchored firmly to the ground, its torso rising above the city's structures, its arms eventually reaching outward in a pose that symbolized power and protection. Though popular imagination would later place the statue straddling the harbour, historical evidence suggests something more grounded, standing beside it, overlooking the ships that came and went. But even standing beside the harbour, it dominated everything. Sailors approaching Rhodes would see it long before they reached the docks, a shining figure catching the sunlight, its bronze surface reflecting the sky. It wasn't just a statue, it was a signal, a declaration. You are entering a city that cannot be ignored. And perhaps that was the point. The Colossus wasn't meant to blend into the landscape, it was meant to redefine it. For the people of Rhodes, it became more than a monument. It was a daily reminder of their survival, their resilience, and their connection to Helios. It stood as proof that they had taken the remnants of war and transformed them into something enduring. But beneath that grandeur, something quieter lingered, because building something this massive required not just skill, but trust. Trust that the structure would hold, that the design was sound, that the ground beneath it was stable enough to carry its weight. And that trust, like the statue itself, rested on fragile foundations, because no matter how carefully a giant is built, it still stands in a world it cannot control. And the earth beneath Rhodes would not stay still forever. After years of labour, calculation, and quiet risk, the Colossus of Rhodes was finally complete. Rising high above the harbour of Rhodes, it stood as one of the most ambitious creations of the ancient world, a towering figure of Helios, cast in bronze and shaped by human determination. It was enormous. Ancient sources suggest the statue stood over 30 metres tall, making it one of the tallest statues ever constructed in antiquity. To the people of Rhodes, it must have felt almost unreal. A human-made structure reaching into the sky, catching the sunlight, and casting long shadows over the city below. But what made it truly remarkable wasn't just its size. It was what it represented. The Colossus was a victory turned into form. The metal that once belonged to enemy siege engines had been melted down and reborn as something enduring. Where destruction had been intended, creation had taken its place. Every plate of bronze carried that meaning, a reminder that Rhodes had not only survived, but transformed its survival into something visible to the world. And the world noticed. Travellers, merchants and sailors spoke of it. Stories spread across the Mediterranean, describing a statue so vast it seemed to guard the island itself. It became one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, not just for its scale, but for the audacity behind it. The idea that a city could build something so bold, so permanent, in defiance of its enemies. But permanence is often an illusion. Even as the Colossus stood in its full glory, it remained vulnerable in ways that were not immediately visible. Its weight pressed constantly against its foundations. Its structure, though advanced for its time, depended on materials that could weaken under stress. And like all things exposed to the elements, it faced forces beyond human control. Still, for a moment, perhaps a generation, it stood untouched. People lived their lives beneath it. Children grew up seeing it as part of the landscape. Ships passed by it daily, its presence becoming almost familiar. What had once been an unimaginable project slowly turned into something ordinary. And that may have been the greatest illusion of all. Because when something extraordinary becomes familiar, it's easy to forget how fragile it truly is. And the Colossus, for all its strength, was standing on borrowed time. For years, the Colossus of Rhodes stood unmoved, its bronze surface catching the sun, its shadow stretching across the harbour of Rhodes like something permanent. Something that had always been there, and always would be. And then, without warning, the ground beneath it shifted. Earthquakes were not unknown in the region. The island of Rhodes sat in a zone where the earth itself was restless, where pressure built slowly beneath the surface before releasing in sudden, violent motion. But familiarity does not mean safety. It only means the danger is easier to ignore, until it isn't. The earthquake that struck in the 3rd century before Christ did not announce itself gently. It came with force, deep, rolling tremors that turned solid ground into something unstable, something unreliable. Buildings cracked. Walls split. People ran into the streets as the city trembled around them. And towering above it all, the Colossus began to fail. At that scale, even a small shift in the earth becomes catastrophic. The statue's immense weight, once balanced carefully across its foundation, now worked against it. The internal structure strained. The bronze plates groaned under pressure. What had taken years to build began to collapse in moments. According to ancient accounts, the Colossus broke at the knees. It's an oddly specific detail, but also a telling one. The legs, bearing the full weight of the structure, were its most vulnerable point. Once they gave way, the rest could not hold. The giant, once a symbol of stability, folded under its own mass. And just like that, it was gone. Not erased entirely, but transformed. The statue didn't vanish into dust. It fell, breaking apart, leaving behind massive fragments scattered across the ground. Pieces of bronze once shaped into a god now lay twisted and broken. The head, the limbs, sections of the torso, all reduced to ruins that still hinted at the scale of what had once stood there. For the people of Rhodes, the moment must have been surreal. One day, the Colossus defined their skyline. The next, it was lying in pieces at their feet. And yet, something even more surprising followed. They didn't rebuild it. Not immediately. Not ever. Because sometimes, when something that grand collapses, it doesn't just break physically. It changes how people see it forever. After the fall of the Colossus of Rhodes, the people of Rhodes faced a decision that might seem obvious today, but at the time, it was anything but. Rebuild it, or leave it as it was. At first, rebuilding must have seemed possible. The materials were still there, scattered across the ground. The knowledge, at least in part, remained, and the symbol, the pride, the identity tied to the statue, had not disappeared with its collapse, but something held them back. According to ancient sources, the Rhodians consulted an oracle, seeking divine guidance on whether they should restore the statue of Helios. The answer they received was not encouraging. It warned them against rebuilding, suggesting that the fall itself was not accidental, but a sign, a message. And in a world where divine will was taken seriously, that was enough. So the Colossus remained where it had fallen, not repaired, not removed, just left. And over time, the broken statue became something new. Travellers continued to visit Rhodes, not to see the Colossus standing, but to see it lying in ruins. And even in pieces it impressed them. Ancient writers described visitors climbing over the fragments, marvelling at the size of its fingers, the scale of its limbs. Some claimed that even a single finger was too large for a person to fully wrap their arms around, which says everything about how massive it truly was. In a strange way, the fallen Colossus may have been just as powerful as the standing one, because now it carried a different meaning. Not just strength, but fragility. Not just victory, but the reminder that even the greatest achievements can be undone in an instant. And perhaps that made it more real, because when something stands forever, it becomes distant, almost mythological. But when it falls and remains visible in its broken state, it tells a story people can understand, a story of creation and collapse. For generations, the ruins of the Colossus lay there, exposed to the elements, slowly weathering under sun and wind, no longer a guardian, no longer a symbol of dominance, but still impossible to ignore, because even in ruin, a giant is still a giant. For centuries, the remains of the Colossus of Rhodes lay where they had fallen, scattered across the ground of Rhodes, like the bones of something too large to fully comprehend. Travellers came and went, climbing over the fragments, measuring them with their eyes, trying to imagine how such a giant had once stood upright. And then, slowly, the world around it changed. Empires shifted. Control of Rhodes passed through different hands. What had once been a proud Greek city became part of larger powers, each bringing its own priorities, its own way of seeing the past, and with each change, the meaning of the fallen Colossus faded just a little more, until it became something else entirely. By the 7th century after Christ, the island fell under new control during the early expansions of Arab forces, and in this new context, the ruins of the Colossus were no longer sacred, no longer symbolic. They were material. Valuable material? According to later accounts, the bronze remnants of the statue were eventually gathered and sold. Not preserved, not studied, broken down, melted, repurposed. The very metal that had once formed a god was reduced to raw resource, traded away in bulk. One story claims that the bronze was transported by hundreds of camels, an image that feels almost too symbolic to ignore. A giant, once immovable, now carried away piece by piece, disappearing into the wider world. Whether every detail of that story is accurate is debated, but the outcome is clear. The Colossus did not simply remain in ruin forever. It vanished, not in a dramatic moment, not in a single event, but gradually, quietly, through reuse, through neglect, through the simple reality that materials, unlike ideas, do not last unless someone chooses to preserve them. And that choice was never made, which leaves us with something unusual. One of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, completely gone. No standing structure, no visible remains, no physical trace that can be pointed to with certainty, just descriptions, fragments of text, imagination filling in the gaps. Because in the end, the Colossus didn't just fall, it was erased, piece by piece, until only the story remained. With the Colossus of Rhodes gone, something unusual happened. It grew, not physically, of course. Its bronze had been melted, its structure erased. But in memory, in imagination, in retelling, it became even larger than it had ever been in reality. Because when something disappears completely, it stops being limited by facts. Ancient writers described it, but never in perfect detail. There were no surviving blueprints, no precise measurements, no exact depiction of its pose, and into that uncertainty, people began to project their own visions. One of the most famous ideas, the image of the Colossus standing with its legs spread across the harbour, ships passing beneath it, likely never existed. Structurally, it would have been nearly impossible for ancient engineers to support that kind of weight in that position. And yet, it became the version most people remember, because it feels right. It feels like what a wonder should look like. And over time, that imagined version became more powerful than the probable reality. Artists, writers, and historians each added their own interpretation. Some emphasized its height, others its brilliance in the sunlight, others its role as a guardian watching over the sea. Without physical evidence to contradict them, the Colossus became flexible, shaped as much by imagination as by history. And in that flexibility, it gained something rare, longevity. Because physical monuments can fall, break, or be forgotten. But ideas, especially incomplete ones, can evolve. They can be retold, reshaped, and reimagined across generations. The Colossus, no longer bound to bronze and iron, became something else entirely, a symbol, not just of Rhodes, but of human ambition, of the desire to build something so large, so bold, that it forces the world to take notice, and also, quietly, a symbol of how fragile that ambition can be, because every version of the Colossus, no matter how grand, carries the same ending. It falls. And maybe that's why it continues to fascinate, not just because it was great, but because it was lost. Because there's something about a vanished wonder that feels unfinished, like a story missing its final image, something that invites you to imagine it for yourself, and in doing so, keep it alive. Today, there is nothing left of the Colossus of Rhodes you can walk up to, touch, or stand beneath. No towering bronze figure. No broken fragments scattered across the ground. Not even a clear foundation you can point to and say, it stood here, and yet it hasn't disappeared. Because some things don't survive in stone or metal. They survive in memory. The story of the Colossus continues to echo through history, not because of what remains, but because of what it represented. A city that turned survival into pride. A people who took the tools of war and reshaped them into something lasting. And a vision so bold that it stretched the limits of what seemed possible in the ancient world. Even now, centuries later, its influence lingers. Modern statues, monumental architecture, even the idea of building something purely to be seen and remembered. All of it carries a trace of the same thinking. The Colossus wasn't just a structure, it was a statement. We were here. We endured. And we built something the world would never forget. And ironically, that worked. Because even without the bronze, without the height, without the physical presence, the Colossus still exists in a way that matters. It exists in the imagination of anyone who hears its story and tries to picture it, standing tall, catching the sunlight, watching over the harbour of Rhodes. But its story also carries something quieter, a reminder that no matter how large, how strong, how carefully constructed something is, it remains vulnerable. Not just to time, but to forces beyond control. The earth shifts, empires fall, priorities change, and even the greatest achievements can disappear, leaving behind only fragments, or nothing at all. And maybe that's the real reason the Colossus endures, not because it stood forever, but because it didn't. Because in its rise and its fall, it tells a story that feels strangely familiar. One of ambition, creation, loss, and the human need to remember what once stood, even when it's gone. And if you ever find yourself standing by that harbour, looking out at the sea, you might notice something unusual. Not a statue, but a space where one used to be. And sometimes that absence feels just as powerful as the thing itself.